Phobias can play a grim role in each of our personal journeys from early childhood to our later adult years. It's an unfortunate fact of life. There are some who are lucky enough to only have fears they don't encounter very often, but there are many more who live with their phobias every day. Nyctophobia is one of those fears. Every night when the sun goes down, the extreme fear of the dark was a nightmare for most of us as children, and some unlucky few got to hold on to that foreboding feeling in their adult lives. Now imagine combining that fear with claustrophobia. Confined in a compressed, pitch-black environment would rapidly allow panic to set in. Your only hope of relief is relying on the help of others. But what happens when everyone else has given up and abandons you to your worst fears? Welcome back to Moonlight Lore. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. By no stretch of the imagination, the Hoosac Mountain range that spans across the western landscape of Massachusetts can't compare to the sheer size of that of the Rocky Mountains, or its extended attachment that is the Appalachian Mountains. The Hoosac Mountain range spans across roughly 16 miles of land, but then connects to the southern Green Mountains of the state of Vermont, which meant making it from one side to the other in the mid-1800s, where our story begins, an incredibly long and strenuous journey. This is why the plans for a railway tunnel that would pass directly through the mountains was a common topic of discussion back in the 1830s and 40s. It would be an incredibly expensive undertaking that would take many years to complete, but the plans were done up, and construction in 1851 finally began. The railway would provide a crucially important connection from New England to the west, and everyone involved agreed this was something that needed to get done. Throughout the early 1800s, it had only been a dream for business owners to be able to ship goods and products to the cities in the west, as it was so difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to do so because of the lack of established roads. A railway through the mountains would relieve that strain on the economy and allow businesses on both sides to finally thrive. The idea of a transport system through the mountains were first proposed in 1819 as a canal system that would run through Deerfield River on the east and the Hoosac River on the west side of the mountains, but that plan would eventually be scrapped for the railroad, which, as I said before, began construction in 1851 by the Troy and Greenfield Railroad Company, just outside the small town of Florida, Massachusetts. The railway would run in a straight line through the Hoosac Mountains and arrive in the city of North Adams in the west, and would end up being 4.75 miles in length, or 7,644 meters long, the world's second longest tunnel at the time. It would ultimately take the workers 24 full years for its completion, costing roughly around $21 million. In today's money, that would equal up to $503,939,210. This was by no means a small investment. But with the completion of the Hoosac Tunnel, all that money and time spent was evidently worth it. They finally had an easy and fast way to transport merchandise. But the financial cost of the construction would pale in comparison to the other costs the men who built the tunnel would make. You see, there's a reason why we're talking about the Hoosac Tunnel today. In those 24 years of excruciating labor and excavation of over 2 million tons of rock and stone, to see the completion of the dream, an astonishing number of people would pay the ultimate price. The reason why the Hoosac Tunnel would take 24 full years until it met its completion was, yes, the American Civil War came and went between the start and finish of its construction, but also because while under the earth, nearly 200 men lost their lives in horrific accidents. The mountains, hills, and forests surrounding the site have long been considered haunted. Although beautiful and picturesque, there are still many who refuse to enter the wilds near the tunnel at night. Reports of calling voices beckoning the lone traveler to venture into the woods, only to be met with a feeling of foreboding and sorrow, have been a common tale among the rural citizens of this quiet, peaceful area. There are few who are brave enough to approach the shadowy threshold of the entrance to the tunnel, and those who do tell of hearing disembodied voices and horrendous screaming coming from deep within the dark, begging for anybody to come and help. But to fully understand why the voices of the miners are still heard to this day, we need to go back over 150 years ago to the 1860s when construction in the tunnel was in full swing. Alfred Nobel, the famed Swedish chemist who, after his death, provided in his will the financial means to found the Nobel Peace Prize Awards, had worked incredibly hard in his life to help create and invent what we know of as dynamite. The raw nitroglycerin liquid that had been used before the invention of dynamite was highly dangerous, and none could attest to the truth behind this statement more than that of miners. Although most miners typically use black blasting powder, the nitroglycerin compound used for clearing and blasting rocks was brand new, and it was here at the Hoosac Tunnel that the first large-scale commercial use of it was used. That meant that most of the miners who were considered experts at the time in the field of using explosives were using a type of explosive very few had any experience with. And aside from the typical hand tools, mining machinery, and black powder, the nitroglycerin proved to be a valuable resource for them to get through the solid and stubborn stone. This is why, in the afternoon of March 20th of 1865, 3 explosive experts entered the Hoosac Tunnel to detonate and blast with nitroglycerin. Ringo Kelly, Ned Brinkman, and Billy Nash all walked confidently into their workstations, preparing to set up their explosives to clear more rock away for the other crews to come in and clear out the rubble. Ringo was responsible for the timing setting on the charges that would detonate the explosives once the men had retreated back to a safety bunker that would shield them from the blast. But he was the only one to make it to the bunker. For some reason, Ringo detonated the charge prematurely as both Ned and Billy were still running towards him. The blast threw chunks of sharpened rock and dust that fell onto the 2 men still trying to escape, and both men were immediately buried alive under several tons of falling rock, neither of them ever seeing the light of day again. Suspected foul play was, of course, on the majority of the mines working on the tunnel. Nobody wanted to work with Ringo Kelly because, quite frankly, nobody could really trust the man anymore. Even if it was an accident like he claimed it was, the other miners were still hesitant on allowing him near the explosives. But even though no criminal charges were laid against him, Ringo would meet a fate many people would deem appropriate. He would either be suspended or laid off shortly after the incident. It's not quite clear which one, but suddenly, nobody would see or hear from Ringo anymore. He had just completely disappeared overnight. The rest of the men didn't really pay much mind to him being gone though. They had work to get done, and as he was someone they didn't really much like nor trust anymore, they didn't mourn his absence and got right back to their jobs. It wouldn't be until a full year later, on the morning of March 30th of 1866, would Ringo be seen again, though the circumstances on which he was found left more than a few miners to become hesitant on being left alone in the dark. By this point in the construction of the tunnel, the miners were close to averaging 100 to 150 feet per month of digging, so by this point they had already laid down tracks for the minecarts to drive back and forth for not only removing debris and stone, but to also carry in the mining crews who were set to work that day. The spot where Billy and Ned had been buried alive a year ago by this point had a track already running through it, and this just so happened to be the exact spot where the morning crew found their old co-worker, Ringo Kelly. As the group of miners were coming down the tracks, they spotted a figure lying motionless up ahead. Nobody was supposed to be in the tunnel this morning, so this was weird in of itself, but the fact this person was lying on the side of the track in a construction area was worrisome. They pulled the brake back on their carts and hopped out to see who this person was exactly. But as they raised the lantern up to this figure's face, they found it to be the lifeless body of Ringo Kelly, having been strangled to death. It's a bit poetic. The same exact place Ringo had sent 2 innocent men to their horrific deaths was the same place he would meet his end, by the hands of someone or something seemingly looking for vengeance. The preceding investigation done by the local sheriff deputy Charles Gibson offered up no clues as to who the perpetrator could have been. With the case being closed and no one being accused or coming forth claiming responsibility for the murder, whispers traveled quickly in and out of the Hoosac Tunnel that the vengeful spirits of Billy Nash and Ned Brinkman had finally taken their rightful revenge. But as justified as this death might have seemed, this upset quite a few folks working from inside the tunnel. Not for the loss of Ringo by any means, but more so because of the possibility of the spirits of their dead colleagues rising from their rocky tombs. Many of the men walked off the job site that same day his body was found, and even more left when the investigation proved nobody was at fault. Complaints about hearing cries of agony bouncing off the rock walls were a common occurrence during this period. At this point, work on the rail line had slowed to a near halt, with the workers who were left on the site refusing to enter the tunnel to work after the sun went down. Many of the investors and bosses on the site began to worry. The supposed curse the mine brought and the deadly ghosts the men would talk about had set the work back for several weeks, and the company needed them to get back on track. That is why a man who worked for the Troy and Greenfield Railroad Company named Mr. Dunn invited another man by the name of Paul Travers, a mechanical engineer and veteran of the American Civil War, to come and inspect the tunnel with him. Partly to make sure everything was up to proper code, and to also ensure the other employees there was nothing they needed to fear about the tunnel. On the evening of September 8th of 1866, the two men arrived at the worksite just outside the tunnel and ventured into its depths just as the last of the miners were departing. They had wanted no interruptions from the work or running sounds of machinery getting in their way of their inspections, but as they left the safety of the descending sun and traveled into the darkness, their confidence quickly abandoned them. In a letter he wrote to his sister following his departure from the incomplete tunnel, Paul Travers said this: "Dunn and I had entered the tunnel at exactly 9 p.m. We traveled about 2 miles into the shaft and then we stopped to listen. As we stood there in cold silence, we both heard what truly sounded like a man groaning out in pain. As you know, I have heard this same sound many times during the war, yet when we turned up the wicks on our lamps, there were no other human beings in the shaft except Mr. Dunn and myself. I'll admit, I hadn't been this frightened since Shiloh." Mr. Dunn agreed that it wasn't the wind we heard, perhaps Nash and Brinkman. Travers had been referencing the Battle of Shiloh that he had taken part in the second year of the Civil War taking place in Tennessee. During this time, and the years that followed this battle, Travers had seen the worst the Civil War had to offer, and as a cavalry officer, he was on the front lines of many gruesome battles, and had first-hand experience with dealing with the dead and the dying. If he truly was afraid of the Hoosac Tunnel, it should speak volumes to the eerie atmosphere the miners felt while inside. Though, I should also mention, during my research on this episode, I tried to find any trace of a Paul Travers mentioned anywhere else, and I simply couldn't. Now, it's completely possible I may have just missed his information somewhere, or had just not dug deep enough to find it this time, but I gather from the lack of results online that this may not be a true part of the Hoosac Tunnel history, and may have just been something added to give the reader a better sense of what goes on here. That being said though, it's a real shame, because as I mentioned earlier, nearly 200 souls were lost under the Hoosac Mountain range. Those men were very much real, and the horrors they faced while digging out the Hoosac Tunnel would leave a trail of blood, sweat, and tears. This story certainly does not need any exaggeration to sell just how terrible things had gotten, and what the miners would go on to call the longest day was yet to arrive. Construction on the tunnel had been tedious and strenuous for the past few weeks. It was October of 1867 and everyone had been scrambling to stay on track before the heavy snowfall of winter slowed down their work even more. But things weren't going so great. The dense rock in the mine was proving to be incredibly difficult to break through at the halfway point, dulling the drill bits after every couple of inches, if not just breaking them completely. And because the machines played such a huge role in the process of breaking down the bones of the earth, Freshly sharpened drill bits for them were brought in every hour to supply the men and to ensure the work was never delayed. And what you could expect, the side effect of every possible machine running around the clock, was the fumes. Black exhaust from all the work, mixed with the gas and fumes that were always present in every mine, had presented the workers with a typical problem they were familiar with. To combat the toxic and highly explosive gas and fumes, they had dug a central shaft, leading straight down from the surface that would connect with the trainway in the main tunnel. Now, this was pretty much just a large chimney that was constructed. It was roughly 1,000 feet in vertical length and 30 feet in diameter. But at this time in 1867, it was roughly only around 583 feet deep. The excavating of this massive hole in the earth was no small undertaking either, and setback after setback continued to make things difficult. The groundwater flowing in would prove to be a large obstacle for the men in this central shaft. And then there was of course the difficulty of hauling out the broken boulders all the way up to the surface to allow for further digging. A small building at the surface was constructed and would house everything the men would need. There was sharpened drill bits, extra tools, a hoist and crane to haul out not only destroyed rock that needed removing, but also to lower the men down into the depths of the earth to work. To draw out the water that continued to pour in and present itself at the bottom of the shaft, a pump was installed at the top beside the supply building, which allowed for the water to be safely removed from the pit and also to apply a steady flow of air pressure for machines to run. This would ultimately be the location that would cement the stories of the Hoosac Tunnel into the history books. It was a Saturday, the 17th of October, and the replacement crew to take over the work at the bottom of the 583-foot pit were descending into its depths. 13 men were riding the hoist elevator down, but something had gone terribly wrong. The men, of course, were armed with their regular equipment, donning their hand tools and supplies that they needed to last their full shift, but there was one faulty piece. A single gas lamp, called a gasometer, that hung from the hoist to provide the workers with light on their descent, had a slight leak to it. It was just a small one, but it was still enough to release the explosive naphtha fumes that emanated from it. The invisible gas floated to the surface, attempting to find its own escape from the dark, and managed to find its relief in the form of a small burning candle in the hoist house above. The resulting explosion sent the men on the surface running for their lives, but the 13 men trapped at the bottom of the pit had nowhere to go. The fumes that had leaked from the elevator and ignited the explosion above shook the entire earth. The 13 men now trapped at the bottom of the pit had only a couple of seconds before they realized what was coming for them. Shrapnel from the destroyed building up top were falling onto them. Flaming pieces of wood with rusty nails rained down on the men desperately searching for cover, but there was none to be found. Quickly following along with the remains of what used to be the hoist house were the 300 sharpened drill bits that pierced through the wood and then into the men unable to escape. When the dust settled and the men on the surface were able to get the fire under control, they were disheartened to find half the pit was buried with debris from the building and rocks that had collapsed. Hope for the men who had been trapped on the bottom was low. Not many people believed anyone could have survived such a deadly and horrific accident. But one keen observer at the top noticed something though. If there were still one or more of the men still somehow alive at the bottom, they were going to meet death very soon. You see, with the sheer destruction happening at the top of the shaft, the pump that had been installed to draw water out of the pit was damaged. The pipes that carried the water out were completely destroyed. This pushed the remaining men on the surface into action, attempting to try and rescue those poor souls still trapped under the debris before the water filled the pit and drowned them. It was a race against time, so a brave man by the name of Thomas Mallory volunteered to be lowered down the central shaft to search for any who may have survived. With the hoist now destroyed, he had to be tied to a rope and slowly lowered by the remaining men above. Within just a few moments of being down there, Mallory was quickly pulled back to the surface again, gasping for air. He was nearly unconscious from the toxic gas that had gotten trapped below and had cut off any oxygen he, or any other, desperately needed. As the men up top got him back to the safety of the surface, they crowded around him, eager to hear what he had to say, if there was any sign of the lost men or not. In a single labored breath, Thomas Mallory was only able to get out 2 disheartening words: "No hope." Work on the central shaft was immediately halted. The horrific screams of the men dying that day was something that stayed in the minds of everyone there. In the days that followed October 17th, those who continued to work near the top of the shaft would see the water slowly rising up the pit, and along with the water came a few of the bodies of the men who were tragically killed down there. For an entire year, no work on the central shaft was done, partly for allowing the workers and families to mourn the 13 men who were lost that day, and also because the workers had no desire to fish out the rest of the bodies of their dead friends who were still buried underneath piles of rock. It was during that year, villagers from the nearby towns would often hear the ghostly moans and screams coming from the darkness of the pit. Glowing lights from miner lanterns would be seen wandering through the woods, but when approached would grow fainter until it ceased to exist, leaving whoever had pursued the light alone in the midnight woods. The miners who still made the occasional trek through the tunnel for work would often hear blood-curdling wails of the dead bouncing off the rock walls. Some had even reported seeing the ghostly apparition of their fallen co-workers still walking down the tunnel with their equipment, only to disappear when confronted. The number of deaths that occurred in the Hoosac Tunnel had continued to increase up until its completion in 1875. Just under 200 miners met their end once all was said and done, under circumstances that left many of the survivors scarred and also terrified to travel underground ever again. Before the disaster in the central shaft that took the lives of the 13 men in 1867, many others had perished by being carried up and down the hoist, meant to bring them safely from the bottom back to the top. The reason is that nobody was eager to go down into the shaft, but after working a 12-hour shift, the men working below were desperate to finally be out of that place and see daylight again. The hoist was only meant to hold a few people at a time, but because they had gotten so relaxed with their work and with the strong desire to be done for the day, several of them would ride along the edge of the small hoist compartment. It was here many of them would fall off and to their deaths, or become crushed by the mechanisms and the rocks they passed by. Further beneath the shaft, the explosions of black powder and the unstable nitroglycerin in the tunnel ripped apart the men who couldn't escape in time. We know this from the deaths of Billy Nash and Ned Brinkman from the itchy trigger finger of Ringo Kelly. But there were several others who met similar fates, crushed by flying rocks released by the explosions. Nearly every day, the miners who worked on the project continued to see the ghostly apparitions of their lost co-workers, and if they didn't see them, they would hear them, crying out in fear and in pain. These stories of the paranormal interested many, but few actually dared to enter the tunnel after dark or even go near it. That is until 1872, 3 years before the mine would eventually finish, did a man by the name of Dr. Clifford Owen become interested in these ghostly tales and wanted to experience them for himself. He had brought along a friend by the name of James McKinstry to venture into the Hoosac with him. Both were incredibly eager to find any clues as to whether or not the famous stories of the tunnel would prove to be true, and luckily for them, they didn't have to wait long to find out. About halfway through the tunnel, at around the 2-mile mark, Clifford and James decided to take a short rest before pressing on. But this is where things got a little strange for the two men. It was nearly pitch black, save for some dim lanterns attached to the wall every few hundred feet, so the men were catching their breaths in a spot that had zero light. Later, Clifford made remarks that it was as cold and as dark as a tomb. When they were about ready to continue on through the tunnel, they didn't take but a single step when they heard a mournful cry of agony echoing out through the darkness. The two stood in complete disbelief. Were they finally hearing what people had been reporting for so many years? Both of the men were complete skeptics. They were both there simply to prove there was nothing to fear and that the superstitions about the tunnel were all nonsense. And even with these ghostly cries, they weren't quite convinced yet. It could, after all, have just been another person coming down the tunnel just trying to mess with them. Though what happened next was a little hard for them to explain. Looking towards the westerly direction, the two men spotted something glowing up ahead. Thinking perhaps it had been a worker with a lantern who was emitting these sounds and light, they expected to come face to face with something tangible. As it steadily approached, it slowly turned into a pale blue color, and it was clear the light was not coming from any lantern. It continued to get bigger and bigger until the light was just so close to them, they realized it had taken human form. The two men were face to face with it, but since it was lacking a head, I guess I will just say they were close enough to reach out and touch it. The blue form stayed motionless in front of the two men before it slowly passed between them and continued its slow walk down the dark tunnel before finally vanishing several feet away, leaving the two skeptics in complete darkness, unable to come up with any sense of what just happened. In October of 1874, 2 years after the incident in the tunnel taking place, Frank Webster, a local hunter, mysteriously disappeared after wandering into the woods near the east entrance looking for wild game. He wouldn't be found until 3 full days later by a search party. They had managed to spot him clumsily walking along the banks of the nearby Deerfield River, mumbling to himself, unaware of his surroundings or how much time had passed according to him. A few short days after his recovery, he recounted his story to his rescuers about how he had gone into the Hoosac Mountain searching for prey, when he ended up near the east entrance of the infamously haunted tunnel. He explained he heard strange voices emanating from within, ordering him to come inside. Almost having no control over his senses or body, he aimlessly entered, where he witnessed multiple transparent figures walking around him. As he watched in disbelief, he claims invisible hands reached out from the darkness, forcefully ripping his hunting rifle out of his hands, then proceeding to club him over the head with it. Unable to recount how or when he had left the tunnel, those looking for him did note he had bruising on his head that did resemble similar markings that would be caused by the butt of a rifle. Though when he was found, Frank didn't have his rifle on him, so perhaps whatever had beaten him still had the weapon. Another mysterious disappearance that took place near the tunnel saw a man named Harlan Mulvaney go missing from the nearby woods as well. Though in this case, he had been hauling supplies into the tunnel by horse and wagon, when all of a sudden, for seemingly no reason, he quickly turned his horses around and whipped them to exit the tunnel as fast as they could run. No one was quite sure what had caused him to become so spooked while in there, but for the following days, nobody would see or hear from him. In the preceding search, the wagon was found abandoned in the woods just a few miles away from the east entrance, but to this day, nobody knows where Harlan had disappeared to, if it was on his own terms, or if something had lured him away. Ever since its completion in 1875, the Hoosac Tunnel has been known as one of the most haunted places in America. Groups of ghost hunters travel from across the country to try and experience the activity that goes on here, but despite many of them traveling great distances, there are still only a few who would dare enter the tunnel and attempt the long 4.75-mile hike through it. Reports of seeing people dressed in 1800s fashion, people getting pushed or pulled by invisible hands in the dark, whistling or whispers off in the abyss can be heard, and even the feeling of someone or something standing next to them have all been recorded and documented by several groups of explorers. The ghost hunters of our time continue to feel and sense all of these interactions in the Hoosac Tunnel, just as the old miners had once felt when they were constructing it. Probably the most disturbing and most common encounter coming from here are the moans of pain and cries for help. These sounds have been around since the first man was killed in the tunnel, and had only been amplified in occurrence after the disaster that took place in the central shaft back in 1867. After the disaster and failed rescue attempt, the workers back then determined nobody could have survived the collapse of the hoist house, falling sharpened drill bits and large boulders, so they had simply left the central shaft to fill with water. Immediately after the incident, the desperate pleas for help could be heard throughout the area, but the workers had chalked it up to more paranormal activity, the same pained cries they had heard for the past several years. They could have never have imagined the horrific mistake they had made, when just a year later, construction on the central shaft continued and the water was pumped out. They began with the removal of the fallen boulders that had gotten stuck on the sidewall of the pit, and had discovered the rocks and debris had created a small pocket underneath that allowed the air to become trapped. It was here they would all feel their hearts plummet in their chests. The screams they had heard and believed were coming from the dead were in fact coming from the lips of their very much alive co-workers and friends. While some had perished from the drill bits, rocks, and gas, there were a few who had managed to survive. The evidence of this being that the fallen wooden debris from the building from atop the shaft had been tied and constructed together to make a small raft. Still gripping it were several bodies of the year-long dead men, obviously having survived the disaster, only to be left for dead and buried alive when the workers up top believed they had all perished and unknowingly abandoned them to their watery tomb. The feeling of guilt and horror rushed through the tunnel to every miner and local who had heard those mournful cries. Nobody was prepared for this kind of discovery, but all understood the Hoosac Tunnel would forever be haunted by the souls of the men who were lost to all of its horrific accidents. It was here, upon finally retrieving and putting to rest the last of the lost miners from the central shaft, was it given a new name: the Bloody Pit. As far as anyone was concerned, the Hoosac Tunnel was a project of hope. Hope that was dug straight through the mountains to a brighter and more prosperous future for everyone. And it has remained that way to this day. It is still in use by the railway and is still explored by eager enthusiasts. Itself remains a symbol of their perseverance and the sacrifice made by the miners over its 24-year construction. And although there seems to be a few who have stuck around nearly 150 years later, we can only hope they eventually find the light from the east or west exits. And just like their friends who perished in the central shaft and were recovered all those years ago, they find their own form of rest, so they too may move on from that dark place. Thank you for listening to the history of the Hoosac Tunnel, also known now as the Bloody Pit. I hope you enjoyed this haunted history of a place that is considered to be one of the most haunted locations in America, and I hope you've been having the best October to date. As always, if you'd like to support what I'm doing here, the best way to do that is by following, subscribing, and reviewing the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. It only takes a few seconds and goes a long way to helping grow the show's community and bring the show up on the podcast charts. But also just listening helps the show a great deal too. If you want to get into contact with me, feel free to email me at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com or follow the Instagram, which can also be found by typing in Moonlight Lore Podcast, where you can direct message me. If you had any suggestions for a future episode, or had a paranormal encounter of your own you wish to share, or you just wanted to say hi, feel free to message me anytime. As always, I love hearing from you, and I hope you have a fantastic October. We are gearing up towards the best night of the year pretty soon, and I have some fun stuff planned for a Halloween episode. Things you yourself could also take part in if you dared. So stay tuned for the Halloween episode, and take care of yourself this season. I'll see you next time.